Hello, everybody. Welcome to our medical grand rounds today. Prior to introducing our distinguished speaker, I'd like to ensure that participants make sure that their microphones are on mute. And after the presentation, Dr. Giannetti will be running the comments and questions period. So please put your comments and questions in the chat. Sorry. So before we go on, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. And we acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. So listen, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Dean Fergusson. Dr. Dean Fergusson is an established international leader in evidence-based transfusion medicine and clinical trials methods. He's conceived, designed, and conducted randomized trials in transfusion medicine and other areas that have advanced knowledge and defined the optimal use of blood products. And he's been an incredibly successful researcher. He's received over 301 million in peer-reviewed grant funding, including 158 CIHR grants and over 114 million as principal investigator. He's published over 680 peer-reviewed articles and has an H-index of 110. And many of these articles, again, define current transfusion practices. He's also a master trialist, one of Canada's master trialists, with research and publications in the methodology of clinical trials and the ethics of clinical trials, with a recent focus on pragmatic trials, which he'll talk to us about later. Dean completed his PhD in Biostats here at McGill University and had previously done an MBA at the University of Ottawa. And is currently a senior scientist at the University of Ottawa and the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute and the director of the clinical epi program at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. On a personal note, I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Dean for over 20 years, and I've learned a ton from him and look forward to his talk, and I'll hand over the seat and the mic to Dean after I organize the share screen for him. There you go, Dean.
Great. Well, thank you very much there, Mark. It's certainly great to be here and sort of tell you about my story through well, prior to COVID and pragmatic trials, and then what COVID and the pandemic meant for pragmatic trials, and ideally the opportunities they present for us to move forward. So I'll just start with forward. Yeah, I need to click there. Yeah, there we go. Those you work now? Okay, great. Yeah, just a couple. I have no financial conflicts of interest, but I was a steering committee member or a PI or investigator on a number of COVID-19 trials, all for academic purposes. Again, no financial conflicts of interest. So we're going to start with a bit of Trials 101. This will be the sort of building block for the rest of my talk, and you'll see why after. But if we start with a simple randomized control trial, we take our study population, a disease condition, we randomize them to treatment or control, we follow those patients up, we assess for outcomes, and then calculate measures of effect to tell us whether the treatment was better than control or inferior, or the control was better than the treatment. And so this is just a simple building block of a parallel randomized control trial that has been the basis of evidence-based medicine for the last 50, 60 years. And I forgot also to mention that we can also have independent data safety and monitoring committees alongside our trials to look at data as data accrues and make any decisions that need to be made. So these simple RCTs, again, have been the mainstay in determining efficacy and effectiveness for the last 60 plus years. And the reason is sort of 4 key elements: that randomization, that allocation concealment, so blinding and masking what the next patient will receive, robust analysis using that intention to treat principle, which means that anybody randomized is also analyzed. They're not dropped out or not analyzed for various reasons. And along with the blinding. So blinding all the partners involved in the clinical trial, from the treating team to the investigators to the analysts to the outcome assessors, et cetera. As much blinding as possible we can bring, it ups the rigor of the trial. So with those 4 elements, they have become the mainstay, and because they minimize the selection bias, getting in and out of the study, but also minimize information bias, meaning bias data collected during the study is less biased. And yeah, so that's the basics of a simple trial. That's all the good. Some of the bad is that they suffer sometimes from generalizability, so that external validity, that trial participants may not always represent the target population and those patients in front of you at the bedside, or in the clinic, so to speak. And so while your trial may have broad eligibility criteria, those that actually partake in those trials are a thinner slice of the target population. And so we need to do much better at generalizing or finding generalizable criteria to ensure generalizability. Then recruitment. There's no doubt that it's a lot of effort in screening patients, finding patients, enrolling patients. And that's why many clinicians and many sites and hospitals don't even participate in trials because of recruitment issues. There's acceptability randomization, where some patients and even their health professionals will just simply refuse to be randomized, or their patients be randomized in hospital in trials, I should say. And this is a big uphill battle that those that could partake in trials are a very, very, again, thin slice. I think it's about, even in cancer, I think it's about 3 to 5% of all cancer patients actually participate in randomized trials. And then perhaps the biggest one is just the administrative complexity. What we have to deal with, ethics boards and regulatory requirements, contracts and the coordination and the running of the trials. They are complex, and as they are constituted now. And because of all that, number 5 is costs. The trials can be extremely expensive because of all that administrative complexity and the, sometimes related to the size of the trial and the number of patients required. So it's because of these disadvantages that a few years prior to the pandemic, I was starting to sort of conceive and conduct and champion pragmatic RCTs. And you'll see what pragmatic RCTs in a slide or two, but essentially the genesis for that is we needed to improve generalizability, but also important, we need to improve on the efficiency in which we conduct these trials, get the costs down, make them a lot easier to conduct. So pragmatic trials comes from a landmark paper by Daniel Schwartz and Joseph Lelouch, now 57 years ago, published 56 years ago in 1967 in the Journal of Chronic Diseases. It's a landmark paper because they set out this nice continuum from explanatory trials all the way through to pragmatic trials, with explanatory being that typically lab-based, very strict controls, very narrow population, and giving you an answer of sort of efficacy. Does this drug work in the lab setting, essentially? All the way through to pragmatic trials. And pragmatic trials are trials where the design mimics routine clinical practice. So digest that a bit. It mimics routine clinical practice, with the only exception being randomization, that patients are randomly allocated to treatment. So 5 key characteristics of pragmatic trials. Number 1 is a very simple protocol. So broad eligibility criteria, multiple settings, not a single center or single institution. There's no protocolized care except the interventions themselves. They tend to focus on already proven efficacious or effective interventions. So there's a lot of head-to-head trials done in pragmatic trials. Efficient and simple data collection. So not collecting, 25 or 40 pages of data, but more streamlined. They focus on clinical and patient important outcomes. So looking at global benefits and harms that matter to the clinicians and matter to the patients. And they also allow for adequate follow-up time. So not necessarily, a few days or a few weeks, but these could be, up to 6 months, a year, 2 years, et cetera, whatever is deemed preferable. So those are the sort of key characteristics starting, from Schwartz and LaLouche of what a pragmatic trial was. But there's certain innovations that we've realized in the last few years, and literally it's been in the last few years. And those, so we can add to those 5 key characteristics that efficient and simple data collection could be our electronic health or electronic medical record, the wealth of provincial and national health administrative data that we have. We can better use that. Because in the end of the day, we're actually going to those records to collect and place those on our case report forms when that data is already there. Streamlined REB approval, we have it in the province of Quebec and Ontario as well, and BC and Alberta, where we have a sort of a centralized REB approval, and those sites joining on to those systems, they just have to, it's an easier sign off for them on the trial. And then finally, there's alternate consent models that we need to discuss and utilize. Aside from the traditional written informed consent, again, 20 plus pages, the patient and their loved ones truly don't understand every bit of it. I don't think it truly is informed consent, but that exists as our current mainstay, and we need to look for alternative ways to written consent. So it could be verbal or oral consent. We could think about waive consent in certain circumstances. So those are the innovations that I tried to bring to the trials that we were conceiving and conducting, and we were well on our way to doing that. And then I'll tell you a bit about the pandemic. So the gist of it is that with these pragmatic trials, that we capture a bigger slice of the eligible population, making them a lot more generalizable, and we can actually truly talk about effectiveness, not just efficacy. So effectiveness mean does something work? Does the diagnostic or therapeutic work in the real world? And by trying to minimize those excluded because they were non-compliant, lost to follow-up, or unanalyzable. And the reason we need these pragmatic trials is because we spend a lot on healthcare every year. I think projected this year, it's about close to $60 billion in Quebec and about 335 billion nationally, just on what the provinces spend on healthcare. And we also know that 25% of patients receiving care receive care that is not needed or could potentially be harmful. And less than 60% of bedside decisions on general medical services in our hospitals are backed by an adequate level of evidence. So there's a lot of room, right? So conducting these pragmatic trials of everyday, effective interventions to see which one is best, which is less harmful, which is more cost effective. There's a lot of room for improvement, which pragmatic trials, I think, play a key role. So as I was saying, prior to the pandemic, these innovations were happening, not just myself and my team, but they were part of a bit of a global effort, certainly in the States with PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which was funded by the Obama's Affordable Healthcare Act. There's the NIH Collaboratory, again, from the United States. The CIHR in the UK, which were pursuing patient-oriented research and also pragmatic trial designs. And then the CIHR here in Canada having their SPORE initiative. So that's the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Initiative. And again, that there is a role for these pragmatic trial designs because of, looking at everyday effectiveness in diagnostics and treatments and screening programs, et cetera. And then along came March 2020, take us all back to the mid-March or so, and sort of as I have on the slide, who knew? But the COVID-19 pandemic was the real catalyst for bringing these pragmatic trials into the fold, and they quickly took center stage. Actually, it was remarkably quick. I do remember on the Thursday and Friday, the 13th or 14th, preparing to be at home for a while. And by the next week, we were engaged as a trial community in largely in critical care, and coming together on saying, okay, well, what treatments can we identify? Which can we test? And within 2 or 3 weeks, we got trials up and running. And I'll go through some of those for you. So the COVID-19 pandemic, again, it was serious, it was urgent, and we needed quick decisions. And so research communities came together across disciplines. I know when I said critical care, we also brought in, the thrombosis world, we brought in the trauma world, we brought in a whole host of different communities together to look at, to identify and to start designing trials around potentially effective treatments. There's also the government and public health recognizing in certain countries, the UK predominantly, but also Canada, recognizing and championing the need for evidence via randomized controlled trials, which was a first. We rarely hear of the governments and public health stepping up and saying there's a clear role for randomized trials. So this, as opposed to, anecdote or, challenging, a few patients in a case series with potential treatments, or as we saw south of the border, even presidential decrees. So that was an important initiative in getting pragmatic trials to the forefront. That was also followed by significant funding that became available in many countries to conduct research and get us answers as quickly possible. And like I say, the innovative pragmatic trial designs and analyses and approaches came to the forefront, and literally within 1 to 2 weeks, they were taking center stage. So again, to take you back, this was just from Ed Mills' article in one of the Lancet series in the spring of 2020. This is from June. We had a ton of potential interventions. Most of them, had some evidence or intuition that they could be effective. And so how do we sort all this out, right? We can't run one massive trial to figure all these out. We need the right design to figure this out. So because of all these choices, it necessitated that the need for robust answers efficiently and quickly, and platform trials, so a type of pragmatic trial that I'm going to talk to you about, offered that promise because it could deal with multiple treatment choices. It could adapt to the pandemic waves by pivoting to hotspots. So we saw that from Spain and Italy over to the States, down to Brazil, back to Europe, et cetera, that a platform trial infrastructure could take advantage of that. So there'd always be a supply of COVID patients, if you will. They were also able to adapt to new potential treatments. So your trial's underway, and then a hopeful candidate comes from either academia or industry, you can plug that into the platform. And most importantly, they brought simple consent randomization and data collection to the table. So the general features of a platform trial, those same 4 key elements of RCTs, so various forms of blinding, certainly the randomization, allocation concealment, which is critical, and also an intention to treat analysis, but everybody randomized gets analyzed. They have one single infrastructure, so that's no different than your typical simple trial, one protocol, central coordination, central data collection, and central analysis. They tend to focus on a single disease, and so it could be multiple settings of a single disease, such as hospital, ICU, community, but it still has to be a single disease. They're multi-arm, as I said, so they can handle multiple interventions. And importantly, they're multi-stage, so they're adaptive. So you can set up rules and predetermined decision rules for dropping arms and adding arms at each stage. So how does this look? We take our simple RCT that I mentioned earlier, and now we design a platform trial where our study population is now being randomized to control, which is generally usual care or the new standard of care, versus a host of treatments. I got 4 treatments up here. And again, those patients are followed. And then there's the first stage. At the end of the first stage, there's an interim analysis to determine what treatments should stay or what treatments should go. So if something is clearly successful at the end of stage 1, then that gets rolled into the control arm because it's a new standard of care. If something is clearly futile after the first stage, it would get dropped. Okay. Now, chances of that happening just because of the decision rules are fairly small, but it could happen. And it certainly happened in this hypothetical example at the end of stage 2, or stage 1, where treatment 2 was dropped, and at the end of stage 2, where treatment 4 was dropped. One was dropped for superiority, the other for futility. So here the dimensions are multiple interventions, multiple stages, and then that simple trial architecture to it. So we can even take that further by having a multi-platform trial. So this represents A, B, and C, 3 separate and independent platform trials that are ongoing throughout the world. But we can also bring them together if they share common controls and treatments. So in this case, we can compare control versus treatment 3 because it was common to all 3 platform trials. So you can imagine the immense power of doing so. So each of these platform trials are enrolling, because of their criteria, broad criteria, enrolling a lot of patients. Now we can enhance that power by cutting across all platform trials and getting our answers much more quickly. And that's what happened. The recovery trial, which I've got a few slides on from the UK, was the sort of the first out of the post and conducted some remarkable research. But there are others: Remap Cap, Attack. Attack was grown here in Canada by Ryan Zarechansky and Patrick Lawler and Ewan Gallagher out of Toronto. And they were just one of many platforms that were happening during the pandemic. And so getting back to the recovery trial, the platform trial in the UK, it gave us our first evidence of an potentially effective treatment, and that was dexamethasone for hospitalized patients with COVID. And a bit of the story here is they enrolled in 176 hospitals in the UK to multiple arms. So you weren't randomized just to control or dexamethasone. You were randomized to a suite of different treatment options. And those patients, in the end, there was about 6,425 that underwent randomization to dexamethasone, just over 2,100 patients, and the 4,300, just over 4,300 randomized to usual care alone. And their main outcome was 28-day mortality. And so the multi-stage, this is lifted from their published protocol in New England. Essentially, they were looking at the independent data monitoring committee, were looking at data around every 2 weeks. And so those were the multiple stages, if you will. And, the rules for determining, superiority were pretty robust, right? That you had to be 3 to 3.5 standard error reduction in mortality. But dexamethasone met that criteria after the 5th look. So they met 5 occasions. So, I guess that's about 10 weeks or 12 weeks or so, and made the decision that dexamethasone was truly effective. So that's a multi-stage component to it, that continuous looks every so many weeks or months. And the results, like I said, over 6,400 patients randomized in 176 hospitals in just under 4 months. So remarkable progress. And that trial was quickly written up and published in New England, and gave the world and treating physicians, hope that there was at least one effective treatment out there. And it reduced 28-day mortality. The number needed to treat for mechanically ventilated patients was only 8. For those needing oxygen therapy but not mechanically ventilated, it was 25. And they also said that it may be harmful in those not requiring mechanical ventilation or oxygen therapy. So those out in the community or the less acute should not be taking this intervention. So this just speaks to the power of pragmatic platform trials, right? Having an answer within 4 months. But they also had other answers. They had answers up until, I think it was late 2021 on 11 different treatments very, very quickly. So dexamethasone alone, as of, within a year, or actually 8 months, was deemed to save over 1 million lives worldwide. So that, again, speaks to the power of these type of trials. Very simple trials, as I'll get to in a while, in a few slides. So that's the platform trial. Then there's also an example of the multi-platform trial, and that's in the area of anticoagulants. And so this, again, led by one of the groups, Ryan Zarechansky and crew for the ATTACK platform. They brought together 3 different independent trial platforms: ATTACK, the REMAP-CAP, which was based both in Canada, largely based in Canada and the UK, and then the Active 4A group, which was NIH sponsored largely from the United States, but they also had sites in Spain. So these investigators all got together real quickly to say, how can we answer these questions, whether anticoagulants improve mortality in both hospitalized patients and ICU patients? How can we answer that trial quickly? And so they came together. They developed a multi-platform RCT using their 3 platform infrastructures, and harmonized the protocols and outcomes across all 3 trials. And the intervention here was based on hospital policy of either low molecular weight heparin or unfractionated heparin versus usual care, which was just the prophylaxis, not therapeutic doses of heparin. And the primary outcome was fairly novel: organ support-free days to day 21. And this measure combines both hospital mortality as well as organ support-free days. And so a novel approach, and also a novel outcome that came out of the pandemic as well. So they harmonized this. So across the 3, they had independent, data coordinating centers that had to get together and supply all their data to an independent statistical group and an independent DSMB for each of these 3 trials. And this just sort of an architecture and data flow and decision making that would happen throughout the trial. So the results, again, in very quick order, from April to November in the very same year, they enrolled over 1,000 critically ill patients, and they actually found that it did not result in a greater probability of survival. The anticoagulation did not result in greater probability of survival, but in the non-critically ill, so those sick enough to and on the wards, they did find increased survival advantage. And that was conducted in 2,200 patients, again, from April 2020. But because of the more patients, they went to January 2021. So, again, in 9 months or so, they had their answers. So just to dissect a little, so that gave you some insight onto some of the trials I helped conduct during the pandemic, dissecting them a bit further to look at the advances and what I call sort of more difficult issues, because there still are some outstanding issues that I think us as a trial and research community, we need to address. So the advances, I've got 4 advances. The first being the value of pragmatic RCTs taking center stage. The second is streamlining those trial processes and data collection and randomization. The research community is coming together, which we are seeing more and more, and the individual trial innovations. So in terms of advancements, this is a letter from the chief medical, so for the recovery trial, this is a letter that went to all hospitals from the chief medical officer of each of the countries in Great Britain, so Northern Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales, along with the the National Health Service Director, to every hospital and every treating physician. And the gist of it is that they were writing to ask that every effort is made to enroll COVID-19 patients in the national priority clinical trials. There are trials in primary care, hospital settings, and ICUs. And this is the, hospital settings and ICUs, which was the recovery platform. So imagine this coming from our health authorities and the decision and policymakers. Enroll your patients in the trial. And I'd love to get a letter like that for every one of my trials. And here in Canada, the same happened in the case of convalescent plasma. So Health Canada recognized that convalescent plasma could be beneficial, and they wanted to ensure that the use was safe and effective, and that a randomized trial would be the best way forward. So they only authorized convalescent plasma use in the use of a nationwide clinical trial, that being the Concord 1 study that took place across the country and actually in the States and a couple other countries as well. But they're meaning you can only have access to the potential treatment if you are randomized into or enroll in a randomized trial. So while the pandemic is unique, obviously for many reasons, the awareness and the need to support such innovative designs and just RCTs in general from our decision makers and funders presents a real opportunity going forward. And I think there's a real opportunity of integrating these platform trials within our health systems. Never mind, necessarily within a clinical group in a hospital, but I think we can think of system-wide across, disease and different conditions. So the second advance was streamlining processes for greater efficiencies. And I mentioned this in terms of consent, randomization, data collection, taking advantage of virtual and digital care for screening, enrollment, and follow-up. And again, just an example from the recovery trial, their simple written informed consent, they got down to 4 pages. Okay, so not the typical 15, 20, or 20 plus pages. Their simple web-based randomization was, again, 1 page. Very, very simple for they themselves or their loved ones or their healthcare providers to or research support staff to randomize individuals. And then simple data collection, a combination of a very simple online form to fill in by research staff or the patients or their loved ones themselves, but also tapping into that routine healthcare and registry data, especially for mortality and the bigger ticket morbidities could be captured using routinely collected data in the UK. So those are huge advances that were put to the forefront by the recovery trial. Research communities coming together. I mean, this is a bit general common sense that if we can come together, we can answer questions a lot more quickly. But it also drove the innovation of data federation and DSM, data safety and monitoring board harmonization, inclusive authorship. So how do you deal with all these authors of different trials and platforms coming together? But they managed also to promote early career researchers within that authorship. And of course, the ability to both learn and do in the face of many unknowns. So I think, oh, there's some slides got cut. Yeah, oh, that moved up. Sorry, trial innovation. So obviously, as I showed you, the growth and acceptability of platform trials really took off during the pandemic. It was growing, and it doesn't mean that platform trials were not done before the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic put them in the spotlight. And as a methodologist, as a trialist, I thought this is, just the perfect venue to be trying these innovations. And it also put Bayes. So Bayes in the medical research sort of mainstream, and I put in brackets finally, because it's taken a long time. But, these trials, again, looking at data as it accrues through Bayesian analyses, through Bayesian response adaptive randomization. So as the trial accrues and interventions are looking more effective, more patients are randomized to those arms. There's dynamic boring. There's also helped handle the unknowns with control rates, event rates, sample size. Because for a lot of these, the sample size wasn't set. It was until they showed an answer that broke the threshold for effectiveness or futility. And then, as I mentioned before, development of novel outcome measures, so ordinal scales that capture clinically relevant morbidity, mortality, and lead to more power, because they're not a simple dichotomy of death, yes or no. So those are some of the advances, and just looking at time here, the sort of more difficult issues to me that arose, and I'm just going to discuss these briefly, but happy to take questions on them, is that the focus in these trials was largely on effectiveness and not on efficacy. For efficacy, we would need placebo-controlled trials, and as I showed you, these control groups were usually usual care or standard care. And I think we missed an opportunity. There were a couple platform trials, I'm blanking on the name, that actually did bring in placebo controls. And I think that's a real consideration, because we need to determine efficacy before we can look at effectiveness. But the war was on COVID at the time, and so we may miss signals for efficacious treatments that just fell out on the effectiveness measure. Interpreting largely unfamiliar analyses. So as I mentioned, Bayes took center stage. I still think there's a long way to go in terms of communicating to the readership, the research community, the healthcare provider community, on how we interpret Bayes analyses, and because with a lot of those trials, they were adjusting for baseline risk factors and so forth. And typically, although it's becoming more common, typically we don't do that in trials because we have randomization and accept balance. So we need help in determining, adjusted analyses from unadjusted analyses. And the final one here I have is the dangers of dropping arms early. So these were moving at quite a pace, and I think we need to spend a bit more time on what the thresholds are for dropping arms. And because we may have some diamonds in the rough there that just got dropped off because of bad timing, so to say, or if we went through double the patients, that there may have been a signal there. So just wrapping up now, the key observations from the pandemic is that pragmatic trials, platform trials played a major role. I think they proved how efficient and cost efficient they were. And again, they were embraced, especially in the UK and Ireland and elsewhere, at a health system level. The use of efficiency of both streamlined and virtual technology to recruit, consent, and follow-up, I don't think should be lost. I think we need to continue that because it's incredibly helpful technology for research and trials in particular. And I think we have an opportunity to capitalize on these advancements in our own clinical and health system environments. So within the ICU, within thrombosis research, perioperative medicine, transfusion medicine, if we have this pragmatic trial sort of philosophy and attitude, and including platform trials, I think we'd be much, much better off. here's the opportunity. So I'm going to end with a couple of slides that, the federal government in their response to the pandemic came up with their biological life sciences strategy to develop made in Canada solutions, both novel, but also non-novel interventions. And so they've set aside about $250 million to develop clinical trial capacity and infrastructure within Canada. And we are fortunate to be, McGill is a big part of it, is the Accelerating Clinical Trials Platform Consortium. And very quickly, we brought together many disease-oriented networks, 11 trial units across the country, including McGill. And I think we will be successful because of the international engagement that we already have. We're connected to 1,500 centers in 100 countries around the world. And now our focus is on accelerating clinical trials and the clinical trials environment in Canada, across the country. And this is alongside the other part of the clinical trial funding with training grants. And here Dr. Jean Bourbeau was very fortunate to receive a large training grant that will provide the training to all those involved in clinical trials, from the academic to the actual doing and right up of trials. So it's an exciting time for clinical trials in Canada. And again, I think the efficiencies with pragmatic trials will play a major role. So with that, I'll end and entertain questions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So maybe while people are writing their questions in the chat, I don't know if you've got any, Nadia.
Yes, there's quite a few questions in the chat.
Oh,
First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Fergusson, for that wonderful presentation. Congratulations. Obviously, you really advanced the way we conduct clinical trials, and we certainly hope that this will be able to continue on in infinity because we really needed those advancements. So congratulations on doing that. Mark, I don't know if you have a comment before we take questions.
Yeah, I wonder, Dean, if you could, speak to the early career investigator and platform trials. And, it probably would seem to an early career investigator, insurmountable to be able to sort of crack the platform trials. I'm going to call it community. I could call it something else.
Yeah.
Any advice for the early career investigator who's thinking about engaging in this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's key is the mentorship and championing of older guys like us, right? I mean, we need to create that environment that brings in the early career researchers to say that that they can play a role. And that's exactly what happened with the ATTACK platform. There were senior methodologists, senior cardiologists, senior intensive care docs that came together, but we let the early career career researchers take the lead, and they had all our support in doing so. And they have now, created careers for themselves off the ATTACK trials, but REMAP-CAP trials. I think it's important. I think, Canada does a very poor job of training clinical trialists. And there's not many, epi and health service research groups in the country, academic, that are training the next generation of trialists. And so I think we've had a void for many years, and hopefully this is a kickstart along with the training grants to bring them back, because it's such a rewarding career of the impact that clinical trials can have. And if we can conduct them simply, right, with tapping into our routinely collected data, having very simple enrollment criteria and so forth, I think there's a huge opportunity.
Fantastic. We have a comment from Sasha. Sasha, we have a few minutes. I don't know if you want to actually ask your question. Otherwise, I can ask it for you, but you can enter the discussions, Sasha, if you want. Okay, otherwise, I'll ask the question. So Sasha Bernaski was asking, the harmonized provincial ethics mechanism that theoretically is supposed to make use of multiple Quebec sites more feasibly has been disappointing. And she's hoping that this can be addressed. I don't know if you have that. You've had that in Ontario, this sort of harmonized, and how that's working out for you, because we've had issues with that here in Quebec.
Yeah. So certainly we do have that in Ontario through the Clinical Trials Ontario. And there's still lessons to be learned. But I think it's us as a research community, still, asking for that change, demanding the change, and the hiccups and obstacles to be removed. But it's going to take, it takes a few trials to get through the system, and we need to challenge that system. But that is our, as part of the ACT consortium, we're trying to work on a national, I'll say a single system for research ethics. I think in the end it will be a federated system, but to make it really easy for our investigators and REBs to communicate and submit, submit their applications, have them reviewed, and then continually reviewed. We need to get there. The know-how is there. We just got to get out of the world of can't, right? And but yeah, we have. Things are much better in Ontario now, but there was, it wasn't all smooth sailing to begin with.
Hey, we have a question from Kabari Dasgupta. Is there an ethical imperative to add a treatment with demonstrated effectiveness within the platform trial for the other treatment arm, and how's that impact the analysis?
Yeah, so that goes to the choice of interventions that are used. I think ideally, and I briefly spoke about this, talking about efficacy versus effectiveness. I think those trial platforms that had placebo controls, obviously they can give us those quicker answers of whether this intervention actually beats placebo, and that's a critical step. There's a lot of interventions out there that are used that are never being tested against placebo, but ideally we test them against placebo to make sure they work. And if they did work, then they would go into, the higher level, trying to look for effectiveness, that real world effectiveness. And so I do think that was an issue during some of these platform trials that didn't have placebo as a control.
Okay, thank you. Question, Dr. Rosenblatt wants to know, from an overall public healthcare point of view, who should decide what therapy should be prioritized for what trial? Who drives that agenda?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do know in the hospitalized patients and ICU patients, it was driven by the investigative team. And they relied on emergency evidence from, rapid systematic reviews or small trials that were being done and quickly collated. From the public health, so in the UK, they also had a platform for the community. I'm not sure how that worked. Yeah, but it is a great question. I think a lot of that, outside of the pandemic and now using these in our sort of everyday conditions and diseases, I think that needs to get worked out, right? Typically, if we had all the time, we would be, one, making sure it's efficacious, and, be driven by systematic reviews of all current trials to ensure that, it's efficacious and effectiveness before jumping in. Yeah.
Thank you for that. A little bit more specific kind of questions. Recognizing that most who died in the pandemic in the first wave died outside hospitals such as on-care facilities, are there efforts to get platform capacity for trials in such settings? Absolutely.
So I mentioned that they did have community platforms in the UK, but I think we'll see that, not wishing a next pandemic, but I think that will be front and center. And these platform trials and simple pragmatic trials have their place in certainly in public health, in global health, and there's some great innovations there as well. So hopefully.
Okay, perfect. Again, coming back to COVID, for these platforms were successful for repurposed drugs. Do you foresee a role for industry-funded trials?
Yeah, I do, because I think Yeah, I think industry themselves may be adopting some of these innovations, maybe not platform. Just reading the question here, but perhaps not for platform, but certainly the other innovations of more simpler, data collection and randomization portals and so forth. In terms of platform trials, I think that might be tough for industry, just given the proprietary nature of even the repurposed drugs. Yeah.
A comment about low molecular weight heparin is expected to be beneficial because they bind to host ACE2 and spike RBD. In trials where low molecular weight heparin was used too many days, was that caused potential bleeding issues?
Yeah, so there was, just trying to recall now. I think bleeding was fairly balanced in both of the groups. So there wasn't. I think it was a bit higher for the anticoagulants, but it wasn't deemed a safety risk or comparison. You remember?
Yeah, it wasn't a major issue.
It wasn't a major issue. I'd like to just open up maybe because we do have a little bit of time. Patrick, can you make a comment? Patrick is our newest recruit and a clinical trialist who is also he's from Toronto. Maybe you could tell Dr. Fergusson what you're doing in clinical trials. Patrick, you want to just unmute yourself?
Hi, Nadia. Thanks very much for the opportunity. And Dean, what a great rounds. Dean and I know each other a little bit through some collaborations. And I have to say, Dean, that was just such a phenomenal talk, as they always are from you. I think it's a terrific kind of segue into a question that I've sort of been wondering, and that's this idea that platform trials and the related methodology might embed very well into administrative health data sources to really kind of create learning health systems. And I know you've done some work in that area, and I wonder if you'd be able to comment a little bit on how far away you think we are from actually being able to do those kinds of trials with administrative linkage, like the recovery trials you mentioned did, and what barriers you see between the provinces as potential challenges and threats to that validity.
Yeah, no, I think we're close. We're really close. That's again our ACT consortium. That's one of our biggest mandates, is to break down those walls between provinces, right? Because that's where the barriers are now, right? They're not within the province. So like within Ontario, we can use administrative data, match it up with local hospital data and any other external data. It's not quick, but it can be done. And we just did that. I just finished a large trial, 9,000 patient trial, looking at red cell donor sex versus and its impact, male donor or female donor, and its impact on the recipient. And we embedded that within our health system at the Ottawa Hospital. So all the data was collected by them. The randomization was done within the transfusion service. And that trial cost, so for 9,000 patients, it cost about 250 grand versus 9 million, which it would have in sort of the typical route. But I think we need to distinguish between the provinces and across the provinces whether it truly is legislation or policy versus just the world of can't. We just need to push through that again, and just like with ethics. And so I think we're getting close. I mean, certainly the federal government and provinces have realized the power of data now, and the power of clinical trials. So I think it's marrying them now, because it leads to so much efficiency. Randomization is easy within a system, and to mimic routine care, we can randomize through our hospital information systems. So I think the future is bright there. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Thank you, Patrick. Jeff, you have a comment there? Would you like to unmute? You're muted.
That's me, Dr. Brechal. So thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I am a hematologist oncologist, and we have been doing a lot of clinical trials for couple of decades, 30 plus years. Though in the last few years, the trials are basically driven by large pharma, which led to many wonderful, very effective drugs, but some of them not so effective. The power of these trials seem to be tremendous. And some of the medications which was determined to be effective in standard oncology clinical trials have been taken off the market again and all this. What do you see is the role of these trials in oncology? Is there a place for these type of trials in oncology? Since we have a lot of sort of pretty much standard treatments which seem to be working, but we are basically pushed to not use those because of the new drugs coming. I think it would be tremendous if some of these standard or frequent oncology conditions could be entered or could be randomized properly in this type of platform trials. What's your opinion on oncology?
Yeah, fully agree. Fully agree. I think your control groups becomes that best standard of care, right? And you want to improve, always try to improve on the standard of care, and platform trials offer you that ability. Not just, a simple trial of control versus treatment, but a number of treatment options. I also think they can play a huge role. So we've gotten, I'm speaking mostly from Ontario and Ottawa, but we've gotten away from investigator-initiated cancer trials, right? So it's usually we rely on industry, and I think that's a shame. And not just for treatments, but supportive care as well.
Absolutely.
And so I do see a role, and in Ottawa, help build the REACT program, which is the Rethinking Clinical Trials, largely in supportive care. So, infection control, antiemetics, and that of randomizing every patient coming through in an oncologist practice to treatment or control, if you will. And just given the sheer volume, you can have your answers very, very quickly. So I do see a big role now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Percal and Dr. Fergusson for that. We're running low on time. I'll just take one last question, maybe if you could answer this one. With broad eligibility criteria, is there a real risk that enrollment at various sites can have catchment populations which are not comparable?
That certainly is a risk, without a doubt. But if you go big and you have a number of those catchment areas, that all speaks to the effectiveness. That no matter what catchment area, that you've shown that intervention is effective. So that increases obviously the generalizability. But you do have to be careful, because there are different practice patterns, and in these trials, the control arm can be a bit of a dog's breakfast, as they say, right? Because there's different different treatment used in different parts of the world at different times and over time. So it is an issue, but that's on the trials for considering that, as well as analyzing that. So looking at the results per site and so forth. Yeah.
Fantastic. So thank you so much, Dr. Dean Fergusson, for joining us today. Really outstanding lecture. Clearly great interest in this topic. Mark, you have 30 seconds left. Would you like to make a final comment?
Yeah, just to echo the thanks to Dean for a fantastic talk, but also his leadership and his advocacy in this area. And, clearly it is the future of, not just clinical trials, but medicine and healthcare. And as Dean pointed out, we certainly spend a lot of money that we don't know whether there's a benefit. And these types of approaches, I think, will get us to a place where we're providing value for the healthcare that we provide. So thanks, Dean, again for everything. Fantastic.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fergusson. Thanks everyone for joining us and for all your comments in this and participating in the discussion. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.